Hey everybody, Plushie here, and I apologize for the delay once again. I was quite busy last week as usual, and in particular, this sort of period of time I got pretty busy, so I wasn't able to push this video out within a week, which is usually what I, try my best to do. But finally, after 1.5 weeks, because we didn't get Typhon as Banner 2, so might as well talk a little bit about the brand new, very exciting Ptolemy Archer, who is technically the second ever transformation character in the game, because I really don't want to count Jekyll and Hyde. They are a very different case where the class change is a bigger part rather than, changing MP types and whatnot. But yeah, this is essentially Melusine 2.0, but an Archer. So does he live up to the standards set up by Melusine? Let's find out in today's hot take video of Ptolemy or Ptolemaeus. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about his face cards, because when I talked about Durga, I remember bringing up how bad her face cards are, and he is not much better. He has a base 0.43% MP gain per hit, and he has a 3-hit quick and 3-hit arts card. So his arts card gain is 1.29%, which is just a little bit better than Durga, and that's not saying much because Durga has one of the worst arts cards in the game. However, there are definitely ways to make up for his MP gain, especially in the refund department, so don't worry too much about it. I just wanted to bring this up as sort of a callback to Durga, because we will be comparing him to the other two AoE arts archers briefly when talking about his farming efficacy. Ptolemy's first skill is a team-wide 20% attack up for 3 turns, as well as heals the team by 1000 HP per turn for 3 turns, and finally, it also generates 15 stars per turn for 3 turns, all on a 6-turn cooldown. So this is a pretty solid sort of compound skill effect. The charisma effect is really decent. Even if you just consider the 20% attack up to himself for 3 turns, it's pretty serviceable, and especially if you do want to consider him in a multi-core setup, which I do think he has some potential, this can greatly help his teammates. The heal per turn effect is, admittedly pretty lame. It's still a pretty okay effect. It's better than nothing. It does help with your entire team sustained by a little bit. And finally, the 15 star per turn effect is also really decent. Usually you don't get this big of a number. Usually you get something like 10 or even 8 per turn for 3 turns. So 15 per turn is a really respectable number, and especially because his Buster form is very much focused on crit gameplay, so this is very useful. And his arts form, arts servants usually have trouble generating stars, so having a star per turn effect on an arts DPS is always something I, appreciate a bunch. And of course, he is an archer, so he has an easier time absorbing these stars for himself as well. So overall, I really like this skill, even though it's pretty simple. Ptolemy's second skill is a team-wide 20% arts and buster duo buff. It also gives the entire party 20% crit resist chance up. And finally, it is also a 50 MP battery, and this skill has a 7-turn cooldown. So yet another really solid compound effect skill. Unlike what I usually would like to say, 20% arts and buster team-wide duo buff is actually pretty nice. Even if this was just applying to himself, the numbers would probably just increase to 30% anyway. So honestly, I prefer this being team-wide, because combined with his first skill's charisma effect, this can be a pretty nice total amount of buffs. Arts buffs also help your supports in challenge quests to get their MP back easier as well. The 20% crit chance rate resistance up is a pretty confusing one for some people potentially, because this has to deal with yet another hidden number that the game doesn't really disclose to you. So usually enemies have a base crit rate depending on their class, and classes that are expected to crit more frequently, such as archers or assassins, they have usually higher base crit rate. For example, assassin usually have 30%, and of course classes that feel like they're prone to crit less usually have 10% base crit rate. And all of these crit rate chances are additive, so straight up subtracting 20% from that number is pretty huge. This straight up prevents certain classes from being able to crit you unless they use a crit chance boost skill. So honestly, this is potentially be a better effect than some of you might think. And finally, 50 MP battery, you know, it's always good. It's good in both forms. Now do note that the 7-turn cooldown on this skill is relatively annoying. In a longer fight, you wouldn't be able to keep your buffs up or the crit chance resist up for long, and in farming, this does prevent you from using double Koyanskaya of Light with his Buster form and use this battery twice, because 7-turn is 1 turn too long for the minimum cooldown required for that kind of composition. But overall, it's still a pretty decent skill, you know, big battery, and it combos well with his first skill as a semi-supportive effect as well. Ptolemy's third skill is his transformation skill, just like Lancer Melusine. What is unlike Lancer Melusine is that instead of being a one-time use, one-way transformation skill, this is a two-way repeatable transformation skill. So if you start out in single target Buster, he can transform into an AoE Arch Servant, and he gains 30 MP battery as well as a 3-turn 30% MP damage buff. The 30 MP battery pairs very well with a maxed out Append 2, and combined with his second skill, essentially he has an 80 MP battery as an AoE Arts looper. He can actually also loop 111 Berserkers with double Castoria, Plug Oberon, and a maxed out Append 2. So in layman's term, he basically loops just like Ruler Melusine as long as he does enough damage, and he can loop any class at any number of enemy per wave as long as he does enough damage. Now he might struggle a lot more compared to Ruler Melusine in the neutral damage department because he has a base 0.95 multiplier instead of Melusine 1.1, and he doesn't have a ramp up MP, but if you do invest a lot into him, he can technically be an Omni Arts looper for you as long as, once again, you dump enough Grails and Gold Foes and just stats in general into this character. If he starts out in AoE Arts form, he transforms back into his single target Buster form, and the skill 3 instead gives him 3 turns of 30% MP gain up, 3 turns of 50% critical damage up, 3 turns of 500% star absorb up, and a 20 star bomb. So this is essentially the bread and butter crit skill. It has every single effect you would ever want in a crit skill. It generates stars, it gives him star absorb up so he can use those stars, and he gets a hefty 50% crit boost that lasts for 3 turns. The MP gain up by 30% for 3 turns is just a bonus that maybe help him get his MP back by using his face cards to crit. Now we did mention that his face card MP gain isn't that amazing, but the 30% MP gain up certainly helps to at the very least bring that up to normal standards. So he is a very explosive critical DPS when he is in single target form. Overall, both of these effects fit the respective form that he transforms into extremely well. As an Arts looper, he gets MP charge as well as MP damage up, which is both really important for Arts looping, and as a single target boss killer, he gets all the critical buffs and stars and absorb up he can want to be extremely explosive and quickly deal with a single target boss. However, this skill also has a 5-turn cooldown, so it feels like the game wants to incentivize you to swap between the forms when you bring him to a longer boss fight. However, from my personal experience, I actually think that is a bit counterintuitive, and it's almost a demerit when you use him in a longer fight. Boss fights usually are more catered towards either AoE or single target, and it's very rare that you want to use both forms in one single fight. And also, most people do build their teams around buffing a singular type of card instead of buffing 2 types of card. Now, I'm not saying that it can't work, because certainly I have tried out teams where I can make it work, and I will go into a little bit more detail when talking about his challenge quest performance, but in general, I feel like if you just use these skills once, they are extremely powerful and very versatile. However, when you want to start to use these skills repeatedly, especially if you just want to have one of the effects in particular, this skill suddenly suddenly becomes somewhat of a 10-turn cooldown skill, which is absolutely horrendous for what effect it is able to provide you. And it's not just a 10-turn cooldown skill, it's a 10-turn cooldown skill that has a potential demerit that switches you into a form where you do not prefer and does not synergize with your current teams. This is obviously a very interesting and very cool experimentation from the Lysengo team, and I very much commend them for it, and overall is a very powerful skill, at least for the first use of it. Ptolemy has a set of generically good passives. He has Magic Resistance B, which certainly helps him against certain boss fights with more debuffs, even though B rank really isn't that game-changing in my opinion. He also has Independent Action A, which bolsters his crit damage by 10% passively. He does have quite a bit of critical focus kits, especially in his Buster form, so this is not shabby at all. He also has Territory Creation A+, which is a passive 11% art sub, which is actually, in my opinion, the most significant passive he has, because a lot of people are just going to use him as a very good arts looper, and a passive 11% arts boost is certainly very helpful for both damage and refund. And finally, he has a passive 20% buff removal resist. Now, I would never want to bet on this unless you are doing some very tight sort of min turns, specific hard quest min turns that you don't really want to fit in another support that can give you buff removal resist. This is more of a meme than practical, unfortunately. And finally, let's talk a little bit about Ptolemy's MP. Of course, he has two, so let's talk about both of them. So his AoE Arts MP is 5 hits. That gives him sure hit before the MP does damage, and it also casts a 20% defense down on all enemies after the MP does damage. And finally, the Overcharge effect is an MP damage buff that lasts for a single turn that scales from 20% all the way up to 40%. So this is a pretty, standard AoE Arts MP. The refund is not bad at 5 hits, and it also gives sure hit, which is a great effect for challenge quests. For example, if you're fighting certain gauntlet quests that have enemies that like to spam evade, he could be a great choice. The defense down, unfortunately, does not help him in farming scenarios at all because it happens after the MP does damage, but if you are fighting a challenge quest in his AoE form, this does ramp up. And finally, the Overcharge effect is also pretty bog standard, but 20% MP damage up to me is a pretty respectable number instead of being a lame 10%. So essentially, he just has a passive 20% MP damage boost on his own MP. Combined with his third skill, he has a total of 50% MP damage up, which is quite the large number as a bolster. And especially considering you might want to plug Oberon on the third wave with him, he has pretty respectable wave 3 damage despite the lack of any anti-trait. And his single target MP just swaps the AoE arts to single target buster and swaps the sure hit effect to an ignore defense effect that is also a buff that casts onto himself, which means that it also extends to his face cards. Everything else is the exact same, and of course the defense down only applies to a single enemy instead of all enemies. So this is a pretty standard single target boss killing MP as well. It really doesn't have anything interesting to say. It does still ramp up, but it is a lot harder to do considering it's a single target buster MP and his card gain isn't amazing. So compared to his AoE Arts MP, this is a lot harder to sort of ramp up. But ignore defense is a relatively rare effect for single target boss killers, at least from my memory. So this at least gives him a niche, and especially considering how rare single target buster archers are in general, he can still be a pretty decent pick. And this being a buff instead of just attached to the MP damage only is really good as well, because he is a very crit centric character in his single target form. So this defense ignore does extend to his very powerful buster crit cards that potentially will come after the MP itself. So overall, I think this is really strong. Also, I guess the defense down is more significant here because it does help his face cards afterwards as a crit centric character instead of just bolstering his MP mostly like the AoE Arts form. So overall, he's pretty decent. Like, his MP isn't the most flashy thing ever in either form, but it serves its job, and most of his highlight is going to be on his skills anyways. So how do I feel about Ptolemy? Well, as usual, we will break it down in both challenge quests and farming aspects. And in terms of farming, Ptolemy is an amazing AoE arts looper. As you can see here, we did some calculations, pitting him against his other two SSR AoE arts archer peers, and without any additional anti-trait buffs, he does outdamage both of them, no matter if we just look at the raw damage without any external buffs, or if we look at a sort of assumption to a normal arts looping comp where we assume they're all MP2, equipping a Black Grill and using double Castoria. So even though he does lack some form of anti-trait, I do think at the very least he makes up for a little bit by his inherent high damage compared to other AoE arts archers. And it's not like Durga's anti-trait is easy to hit in farming nodes, and also Jarcher just straight up doesn't have any anti-trait to begin with. So Ptolemy is extremely powerful in comparison, especially when you limit the scope to just AoE arts looping archers. And you can see here his refund does lose out a little bit compared to the both of them. However, he more than makes up for it with his massive amounts of battery. In fact, his battery is so good, being a 30-50 split battery that combines into 80, this allows him to basically loop the same like Ruler Melusine, meaning that he can loop any enemy class and any enemy number as long as he does enough damage in 3 turns, which is very impressive. And of course, the assumed setup is double Castoria, plug Oberon with Ptolemy and a maxed out Append 2, equipping a Black Grill or any CE with no initial charge. And the sequence of skill activation I will just show on screen right now, and then, you know, because of the clip on screen not being Berserker, I will also show the calculations I did with the bot and see how much refund he gets against 111 Berserkers, and if he can hit 1 hit of overkill with his MP, and, you know, prove that he has enough charge for that as well.
いざ開け H の門全知全能ならざる我らが全知全能なる者へと挑む祈りを掲げ走れよ さてあの話の続きはと早炊きですカルウェル誇りにかけて あの図書館を開く気になったか世界の集積を知るがいい我らの行く末を知るがいい我らの旅路を思うがよい祈りを掲げ走れよ 早炊きですカルウェル いざ開けしよかろう殲滅だいざ開け H の門全知全能ならざる我らが全知全能なる者へと挑む祈りを掲げ走れよこの手はどうだ
Do note that Ptolemy isn't just an AoE arts looper, he is also a single target buster archer with a 50 MP start CE. Now admittedly, this form is a lot less exciting in terms of farming because of his long cooldown on his 50 MP battery, and also he is not able to gain any MP charge when he transforms into his buster form. He just isn't able to fit into the double Koyan light system. Ironically, he probably farms 111 nodes better with double Castoria in his AoE arts form compared to his single target buster form. However, I can definitely see some potential in his single target form in a multi-core setup. Sometimes you just need a single target archer beat stick with 50 MP charge to kill a saber or a berserker, and he can do the job just fine. Add on the fact that he has pretty decent team-wide buffs with a 20% charisma as well as a 20% arts and buster dual type buff. I can certainly see some good use of him in multi-core, but perhaps the most interesting part about Ptolemaeus' farming is his ability to transform mid-farming wave. Now, I did make a video about him transforming multiple times in a singular farming node. However, I think it's much of a meme because you are locked into using double Koyan Sky of Light because you need the cooldown reduction in order for him to activate his transformation multiple times, and that severely limits the amount of compositions he can be fit into. This also makes his AoE form exceptionally weak because Koyan Sky of Light, unless you are fighting against man attribute enemies, just is not able to provide any amount of additional buff on top of the 50% buster ups, which is horrendous if you're forced to clear a high HP wave with his AoE form. I do see some potential though in his farming if he just transforms once. Maybe he uses his single target on the first wave and then AoE on the following two, or vice versa, using his AoE form in the first wave and then single target in the following two. I do have some bad news though in terms of the first kind of setup where he uses his single target in the first wave and then using AoE in the following two. When I did some calculations for his damage in single target form without the additional 100% arts up from 2 Castorias is about the same as his AoE form with the addition of 100% extra arts boost from the 2 Castorias. And with Buster, you are actually sacrificing the minuscule amount of refund you will get. You might be better off just using his AoE form anyways to get that little bit extra charge from his refund on the first wave. Now obviously I made some assumptions while making this calculation, so certainly different CE choices and different skill use sequences can shift the results a little bit, but I can't imagine it to drastically vary from the conclusion I made. And of course, even in my calculations, the single target does do a little bit more damage than the AoE form, and in certain farming nodes, you are just missing that little bit of extra damage, so I can certainly see this still being used. What I'm trying to convey here is just that it might not be as useful as it initially might seem. This is actually kind of similar to Lancer Melusine because technically she can still start out with single target mode and then transform into AoE Buster mode. But because of how good these Servants AoE modes are, a lot of times you might just be better off using their AoE modes straight up. You are certainly sacrificing a lot more by not using Melusine's AoE mode on the first turn because Melusine also has a ramp up effect while Ptolemaeus doesn't. But you know what I mean, like usually it's just good enough to use him as an AoE arts looper. Now there are certainly some merit if you do it the other way around, where the first wave is multiple enemies and then you pivot into a very hard hitting single target buster composition. However, once again he might be held back in that aspect because of his long cooldown on his 50 MP battery once again. In terms of challenge quest performance, Ptolemy seems to be pretty straightforward at face value. During the day he's a hyper offensive single target buster boss killer who is also focused on doing massive amounts of crit damage. He has the special niche of being able to bypass defense buffs, especially ones that are unremovable, which can get very annoying on certain boss fights. And during the night, he's a very consistent arts looper that can constantly spam defense downs on all enemies, slowly ramping up his MP damage. Both forms of Ptolemy can provide the team with moderate amounts of support, including increasing their resistance against critical hits, increasing their arts and buster efficiency, and of course providing them with a tiny bit of heal. He also has a star engine, which in the day combos well with his star absorb up effect on his third skill, which makes him crit even more consistently, and during the night gives him additional opportunities to crit and refund with his arts crits, which is usually not that accessible to other arts DPSs. However, the problem arises when the first 5 turns pass and you start to contemplate whether you should transform a second time. Now, there are certainly some merit to do this, but there are certain scenarios where I think it's just almost, incentivizing you to not press the button at all. For example, if you're starting out in a single target form, you're usually only fighting a singular enemy and you aim to burst them down quickly. So you don't really want to transform into a softer hitting arts AoE DPS with your buster centric team. He suddenly would not be able to do a lot of damage at all, and if you want that critical boost skill back, you essentially have to wait 10 turns and also keep yourself in this AoE mode that can't be supported by your supports for 5 turns as well. So honestly, if you are using him as a single target buster, I would suggest finishing off the fight quickly and just not transform at all. On the contrary, there are some more merits transforming him into single target in a arts AoE team, because first of all, I think art supports are so strong. Usually you are bringing a Castoria in boss fights anyways, regardless of what kind of DPS you are bringing. And also, there are more scenarios where you are maybe fighting against a gauntlet, a wave of enemies, and finally you are, left with just 1 or 2 enemies. You can transform into single target mode and try to burst them down with hard hitting crits. Busters DPSs also do quite appreciate arts buffs when you want to regain your MP by using an arts crit. So honestly, I can see this happening, using him as an AoE arts to start off and then finally finishing off an enemy with his single target buster form. You can obviously try to build your team where you time your transformation to when maybe one of your supports die off and another card type support comes up. So I did make a video on this. For example, I start out with Lady Avalon and Castoria supporting him in his arts AoE form, but then Lady Avalon dies off and then he transforms into his buster form, and then Merlin comes up and suddenly he can do a bunch of buster, burst damage. But I feel like for most usual players, this is more of a meme, and also the only reason I can do this consistently is because this particular fight has a very set pattern for you to exploit. So usually, if you're going in blind against a boss, you don't really want to build this wonky team where you have 2 different card type supports. You can also obviously build like a Castoria and Merlin split color team, but I feel like at that point you are just playing into the gimmick a little bit too much. Maybe you're better off just sticking to a singular mode. But the problem with sticking to a singular mode means that essentially you lose out on his third skill. Like, you're just locked out of using his third skill forever after the initial proc, which is also pretty horrible. Overall, I really prefer other alternatives to him in terms of challenge quest performance, especially in the arts department. Like Durga or Jarcher is probably a lot easier and intuitive to use compared to Ptolemy. His buster form is certainly fine because you are aiming to finish off your enemies quickly anyways, and you don't really expect to click his third skill a second time, but you do lose out on that advantage of using Koyanskaya of Light, where most of the times you're able to use your buff skills twice with the cooldown reduction, and with him you can't really do that. So I'm not trying to say he's bad, I'm just trying to say this transformation gimmick turns out, at least to me, with my limited amount of testing, more of a demerit than a bonus. Personally, I think he would have been a much better servant if the transformation only happens once and then you're locked into a singular form, but that effect still retains after 5 turns. So like the 5 turn cooldown on that skill is very deceptive because you can't really use that skill every 5 turns essentially. In conclusion, Ptolemy is a very exciting character, being the second ever transforming SSR after Melusine, and he certainly lived up to the hype in certain aspects. He is at the same time one of the best AoE arts loopers in terms of refund, as well as a very competent crit damage dealer in his single target buster form. However, I do think he also falls into a similar problem with Melusine, where people tend to like to gravitate towards locking him into a single form, rather than taking advantage of transforming him back and forth in a singular fight. And it ends up being more of a hindrance than an advantage, with his ability to transform multiple times but also forced to transform whenever you activate that skill 3, making that 5 turn short cooldown essentially a fake cooldown number depending how you want to see it. But obviously this is not me trying to detract from his value. Being two pretty decent servants in one is already extremely good, and also for some people I feel like being one of the best refunding AoE arts loopers alone is already good enough to pull. Certainly a character that will yield you a lot of value if you like him a lot and is willing to invest MP levels as well as foes into. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed the video. I apologize for the delay once again, but finally hope this at least helped a little bit in terms of helping you maybe decide whether you want to invest more into this very cool character. And of course, as usual, wish you the best of luck of pulling Ptolemy, and I'll see you guys in the next one.